Hey there. Welcome to Real Talk Recovery. My name is Bryant, and I'm glad you're here. Whether you're just starting your recovery journey, further along, such as myself, supporting someone you care about, or you're just curious, this is the space for you. This is a space for honesty, support, and growth. I'm a recovering alcoholic and a gambling addict, and we're going to have an honest discussion today, like we do every day. Well, every time we post. But before we dive in, I want to give you a quick heads up about the way things roll around here. This is a no-frills channel, so you'll hear some background noise. Maybe even my cats running around because they never sit still. And you may very well hear me cough a few times. In fact, in the previous episode, you heard that. My microphone is in a position that might cause an echo. And I'm not going to be cutting those awkward little moments where I trip over my own words or struggle to find the right thing to say. You're getting it all real. So with that out of the way, let's get right into it. Today's topic is about self-medication. And the fact that all of us addicts, all of us substance users, we started out as merely self-medicating until things got progressively worse, until it turned into a full-fledged addiction. And like I'll continue to say, I'm not a mental health expert. I'm not an addiction expert. I don't necessarily understand the science of how things work. All I know is what worked for me and the realization that I am an addict. Well, modern terms would call it, I have a substance use disorder and a process addiction. But anyway, self-medication. It sounds like something you might hear about in a therapy session or read in a book. But the truth is, we've all done it at some point, whether you are an addict or not. Whether it is a late night drinking binge eating, or turning to drugs, it starts with something that seems so small. But why do we do it? Why do so many of us find ourselves looking for a way to numb or escape, rather than face what we have going on inside? For a lot of us, it starts with emotional pain. You have things that you don't want to face, whether it is guilt, anger, depression, anxiety, past trauma. Those feelings are overwhelming. So you look for a quick way out. And for a while, it works. You get that temporary relief. That moment where you forget about everything that's weighing you down. But then, you have to go back for more. I'll tell you, I know this from personal experience. There were times where I drank or gambled to escape my own head. At the time, it felt like relief. It felt like I could breathe for a second. But after a while, I realized that what I was doing was running away. And running away doesn't fix anything. It just buries it deeper until you can't breathe at all anymore and you start suffocating. Now, self-medication isn't just about substances. People, they self-medicate in all kinds of ways. Overworking, overexercising, and even excessive socializing. These are all forms of self-medication that people don't often talk about. It's like this pressure to keep moving, keep doing, keep pushing, anything to avoid facing the hard stuff. And it's much more common than we think. And what makes it even worse is that we're often so good at hiding it. You don't always see the signs until it's too late. And even then, you might not recognize them for what they are. Think about it for a second. When was the last time you pushed through something tough? And you told yourself that it's fine, I just need to keep going. We've all been there. You've got to work extra hours to make up for feeling like you're not doing enough in your personal life. Or maybe you're in a relationship and you're just trying to avoid the conversation that's really scaring you. That's self-medication in the form of avoidance. So, how do we know when self-medication has crossed a line? Well, there are warning signs that we often ignore or convince ourselves that they aren't a big deal. But once you start looking for them, you can't unsee them. One of the first signs is when the substance, activity, or behavior you're using to self-medicate, it stops being just a once in a while thing. When it turns into something you need to get through the day, that's when you need to start asking yourself some serious questions. Maybe you're drinking every night, and what used to be one drink turns into three. Maybe you're gambling every day, and what used to be a small bet has turned into a full-on obsession. That's what happened with me. And it's not just about the quantity. It's the emotional impact it starts to have on you. Are you using it to avoid certain situations? To block out emotions you don't know how to deal with? Are you finding yourself withdrawing from things you used to care about? Just so you can keep self-medicating? Let me give you an example. There was a point in my own journey where I wasn't just drinking to cope with stress. I was using it as a way to shut off from everything. My relationships were strained. I was calling in sick to work all the time. I even stopped doing the things that I enjoyed because all I could think about was how much I needed that next drink or how much I needed to place that next bet. I didn't realize how bad it was until I was lying to myself about it. And I didn't realize that until I ended up in rehab. It's easy to tell ourselves that everything is fine. But the truth is, self-medication often isolates you. You stop asking for help because you're afraid people will see the cracks in your facade. But let me tell you, those cracks are there. And if you don't address them, they will keep spreading. Think about the people around you. Have you stopped going out with friends? Maybe you find excuses not to go to family gatherings. Maybe you've isolated yourself because you're afraid someone will notice your coping mechanisms. Or worse, confront you about them. One sign I've seen in myself and others is the constant rationalizing. We tell ourselves things like, I deserve this, or it's just one more time. That's when we're really fooling ourselves. Telling ourselves that it's okay to go down that path just once more, with no realization of how deep we're getting into that hole. Now, let's talk about some of the challenges around self-medication that don't always get discussed. We often focus on drinking and drugs, but there are other less obvious ways people self-medicate. And I kind of mentioned this earlier. Take overworking, for example. We live in a world that values hustle and productivity. It's easy to get caught up in the idea that if you're working all the time, you're doing the right thing. But what happens when work becomes a distraction from everything else? You're hiding everything. You're hiding from your emotions, your relationships, and your personal life because it feels safer to bury yourself in work. But eventually it takes a toll, physically, mentally, and emotionally. Another thing to think about. When was the last time you put in overtime, worked late nights, or ignored the needs of your body just because you were too caught up in the grind? Overworking doesn't seem as dangerous on the surface, right? But when you're working to the point of exhaustion, you're avoiding the feelings you need to address. It's like pushing a snowball down a hill. The longer you let it roll, the bigger it gets. In the same vein, overexercising can be just as damaging. People often think that exercise is healthy, and it is. But when it becomes an obsession to the point where you're pushing yourself past your limits for the sole purpose to avoid your emotions, that's when it crosses the line. Your body, it can only handle so much before it starts breaking down. And while your physical health will improve, your mental health is not getting any better. And in some respects, it's deteriorating because you're avoiding the real work. Over the years, I've met people who've turned to exercise as a way to avoid their feelings, not realizing that it can become just another form of self-medication. They'll push their body to extremes because it's easier than dealing with emotional pain. We as humans in our culture don't deal with emotional pain well. And don't get me wrong, like I said before, exercise is a great thing. But when it's used to escape, it's a red flag. And this doesn't just apply to substances or habits. Like I said before, socializing or seeking validation and using people as distractions. These are also forms of self medication. In a way, it's all about avoiding pain. It's all about avoiding discomfort or the unknown. But eventually, the price of that avoidance catches up with you because we can only outrun our issues for so long. So, what can we do instead? How can we find healthier ways to deal with life when it gets overwhelming? Because life gets overwhelming daily. Well, the first thing is we need to acknowledge that self medication isn't just a bad habit, it's a dangerous coping mechanism. We also need to recognize that it's how you've learned to survive, even if it's not the best way. But recovery is about unlearning those unhealthy habits and instead installing healthier, more sustainable coping mechanisms. Because a coping mechanism is not a bad thing. It's the unhealthy coping mechanisms that are problems. One thing that I had to do, one of the first things I had to do, was I had to get honest with myself. I had to admit that I wasn't just using substances or distractions to feel good. I mean, the endorphin rush was huge and they did make me feel good until I came down and then I was no longer feeling good. But I was also using them to avoid dealing with my feelings. And I had to be okay with feeling uncomfortable. And that is hard. One of the tools I found most helpful is mindfulness. Taking the time to sit with my feelings, however hard it is. Therapy and group support are also key. It's not about doing this alone. You need to talk it out. Whether it's with a therapist, a support group, or even just a friend you trust. Isolation is one of the most dangerous parts of addiction and recovery. And even in rehab, when you had a traumatic experience, they would not let you go back to your room and remove yourself from everything because they understood just how damaging isolation can be. But another thing that helps is taking it day by day. I used to think one day at a time was a cliche until I started my recovery journey. Because one day at a time isn't some sort of goal. It's a mantra used to explain how to live in the present moment. Don't dwell on the past and don't be obsessing about the future. that doesn't mean avoiding making plans, or you go to the doctor and they say, oh, we need to see you again in 2 weeks, and you go, well, call me in 2 weeks and I'll come in that day. That's not what that means at all. But recovery is a long journey, and you need to take it one day at a time and stay present, because you're not going to fix everything overnight. But every small step is a victory. And celebrating those victories, no matter how small, is important. So, that's all I've got for today. Remember, progress, not perfection. The road to recovery isn't easy, but it's worth it. And as always, I would greatly appreciate it if you were brave enough to post your journey, your recovery, and share this with someone who might need to hear this. But more importantly, I'm proud of you for showing up. And thank you for listening. I'll talk at you later.